Jesus has been killed, but the apostles don't intend to let his message die.
We're talking about going from this small fringe group of scared men to starting this whole new religious movement.
How did that ever happen?
12 men believe they're in a race against time to save the world.
When you think about all the obstacles in a way, persecution, martyrdoms, crucifixions.
It's one of the most amazing things that's ever happened in the history of religion.
It's a Friday. It's either Passover or it's very close to Passover.
We call that day to the present day Good Friday, but there was nothing good about the first Good Friday for Jesus.
The Romans did like to think of some of the gorier ways to kill people, but crucifixion is one of the worst.
What's really difficult about crucifixion is breathing. The criminal has to try and lift themselves up on the cross.
You're alive as long as you can pull yourself up and have enough room in your chest for your lungs to work.
The nails cause bolts of agonizing pain through the condemned criminal's arms and legs.
And when you get too tired, the weight would come down on your lungs, then you'd suffocate. But sometimes that can take days. Crucifixions were intended to be deterrents.
It served as a warning to others that if you rebel against the Roman Empire, you too will die in this horribly humiliating, excruciating manner. It's not for nothing that the word excruciating means out of the cross. This terrible death, this could happen to you.
Historically speaking, I do not imagine crowds surrounding Jesus.
Mary Magdalene and the women keep vigil, but the apostles, the disciples that Jesus trusted most, aren't there.
They're sort of conspicuously absent.
The apostles are locked up in a room, and they're in there out of fear. They had absolutely no idea what kind of fate was going to befall them.
It looks as if they probably went into hiding, which would make sense. If Jesus was arrested on political charges of calling himself the king, and they were following him, they too would be guilty of insurgency.
For all they knew, the next moment would bring a knock at the door and Roman guards would be there to arrest and execute them too.
These men are the 12 chosen by Jesus.
The most important thing about the apostles is their name, the 12.
Why not 9 or why not 14?
12 is a very symbolic number. It's the 12 tribes of Israel.
And so, as there were 12 tribes once upon a time, there should be 12 apostles.
They were Jews living in Galilee. Several of them in the Gospels are referred to as fishermen, so we know that probably most of them were tradespeople.
And they don't really have any formal training in religious matters any more than any other person would have at the time.
Jesus comes along and offers a really radical proposition. Why don't you leave the life that you have known for all of your time on this planet and come follow me, because I have these crazy ideas.
But they're not so clear about the names, exactly who these people were.
All of our Gospels mention the 12. Some of them list the 12, but they list different names.
If there's like a sort of a go-to group among the apostles, it's not necessarily the 12. It's actually 3 of the apostles, Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Jesus is always taking them aside for special instruction and special revelations.
They were there from the beginning.
Peter's the best known disciple of the 12 because he was Jesus' closest right-hand man. His name wasn't originally Peter. This is the nickname that Jesus gave him. Petros, Peter. The word Petros in Greek means rock. But in fact, when you read about Peter's life, he seems like anything but a rock. He seems more like shifting sand.
In one story, he's said to have cut off the ear of one of the men sent to arrest Jesus. And then hours later, he denies ever having known him.
Peter's asked if he is traveling with Jesus or knows the person of Jesus, and he outright denies that he has anything to do with this person. The tradition about Peter says that he lies.
He flubs it. Peter fails. And it's a moment of tremendous disappointment to him.
It's a moment that would have been unimaginable only a few days earlier. The apostles had traveled with Jesus and his small band of followers to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover.
Passover is a celebration of the liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery.
But they're also sort of anticipating the future when they hope God will liberate them from their current oppressors, who are the Romans. The current Roman governor was Pontius Pilate, and he's particularly aware of how things could go wrong very quickly.
To the Romans, Jesus was a nobody, but they couldn't afford to let him become a somebody.
For Pilate, the way Jesus and the apostles enter Jerusalem is a provocation to the authority of the empire.
I would consider it an historical fact that he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Pilate, without a doubt, on a horse. But it's a dangerous lampoon of Pilate.
The fact of the matter is, Jesus was a subversive. The chutzpah of it all, that this young man out of Galilee could pretend that there is another kind of empire, namely the empire of God. It's no wonder he got himself crucified.
In the first century, there were many different ideas of what the Messiah might be. But none of them included a humiliating, excruciating death at the end.
At this point, when they're in the upper room, they're terrified and they're confused and distraught. This was not what they had expected, not what they had hoped for.
Were they wrong to follow this guy? Was he claiming to be something that he wasn't? These are people who've left their families, who've literally walked away from their lives to follow this guy. You can't just go back and say, oops, I was wrong. So they've got to figure out what to do.
Just hours after being nailed to the cross, Jesus of Nazareth is dead. His death will draw the apostles into some of the most mysterious events of early Christianity. 2 days later, on a Sunday morning, a visit is made to Jesus' tomb.
It's the first day of the week, and a number of the female followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, arrive at the tomb with some spices. And much to their surprise, they enter the tomb and it's empty.
The body of Jesus is gone. The women are the first to enter the tomb since it had been sealed 2 days earlier. They are unprepared for the experience that follows.
Two dazzling figures appear to them, and one of the figures says to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?"
The women flee. Mary runs back to report the missing body and the strange visions to the apostles. But they don't believe the news.
For obvious reasons, because it seems incredible that somebody would be raised from the dead.
Peter, lo and behold, goes back and finds out that the women were accurate. The tomb is empty and Jesus is nowhere to be found.
I think the reality is that historians don't know what happened about the empty tomb. What we do know, I think with reasonable assurance, is that sometime after Jesus died, some of his followers were saying that he'd come back to life.
They start to see Jesus. Jesus appears to them.
Jesus appears to his disciples, and they actually think he's a ghost. And In response to this, he joins them for dinner and eats broiled fish.
Jesus is hungry, and he wants to eat. He's been dead for 3 days.
And ghosts don't eat. So they knew that this was a real man. This was the real Jesus right there with them.
The message you're getting is Jesus is back, but almost back as extraordinarily normal as he used to be.
This isn't a vision. This isn't a ghost. This is a bodily resurrection.
The apostles are convinced that Jesus has returned from the dead. To them, these visions are absolutely real.
Do they really have visions, or are they just suffering from mass hallucinations brought on by psychological stress?
It's possible. But in the first century, visions were taken for granted correctly as a normal part of life. Visions are real for them, as they are for anyone who has them. But visions don't always start world religions. What we're trying to understand is, why did these visions do what they did?
The resurrection provides the apostles with divine confirmation.
God doesn't just raise people up willy-nilly. He chose this one to raise up. You know, the guy who just got crucified, he's the one that God chose to raise from the dead. That ultimately confirms everything that they believed about following him in the first place.
And so he must be the Messiah, because now he's more powerful than death. He is the ruler, he is the Lord, and he is the future king of the coming kingdom.
The resurrected Jesus tells his men that they're the ones he's chosen to spread his word to every nation on earth. But before that can happen, they'll need the power. He won't say when, and he won't say how it will come. Then Jesus ascends to heaven and leaves his apostles with the biggest mystery of their lives. According to the Gospels, following his resurrection, Jesus ascends to heaven, and the apostles travel from Galilee to Jerusalem to wait for a sign from him. It's almost impossible to know if and when that journey really happened.
Unfortunately, historical records from the Roman Empire don't tell us anything about early Christianity. This is a complete black hole.
But one book in the Bible may provide clues.
The book of Acts is our first church history. Luke, we don't really know who wrote it, but we call him Luke. He wrote Acts of the Apostles to tell the story of the early church.
The Acts of the Apostles provide us with a very good story. It's not very good history.
It's an amalgam of fact and fiction from a point of view maybe even up to 100 years after the death of Jesus.
By telling you these seemingly implausible events, Luke is trying to seduce you into wanting to hear the story, to hear more, and to perhaps even join the movement.
The book of Acts begins with a series of miraculous events. One of the first happens at the festival of Pentecost, the Greek word for the Jewish feast of Shavuot, celebrating the moment God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Peter is presiding when all of a sudden,
The Spirit comes.
Suddenly there's this sound like a whirling wind.
And tongues like fire come over each of the disciples.
All of a sudden, the disciples begin speaking in other languages.
Now, we're not talking about speaking in tongues like you find in charismatic churches. We're talking about instant berlitz. Everyone can speak every language. Jesus is gone, but his Spirit is here. And his Spirit is a galvanizing empowerment.
It's a pretty fantastic story.
According to the book of Acts, Peter gets up on the day of Pentecost and preaches a sermon, and thousands of people convert. And a few days later, preaches another sermon, thousands more people convert. And so within a couple months, Jerusalem is 2/3 Christian. That's absolutely not true. There is no way that that happened. My hunch is that we're talking about dozens of Christians coming into the church in the 30s, possibly hundreds of Christians, but not tens of thousands.
But whatever the truth behind the numbers of converts in the Pentecost story, the apostles have been transformed.
And that's the key point. They feel empowered to now go out and spread the message. This is the point at which they sort of graduate from being disciples into apostles, messengers of God.
The term apostolos in Greek comes from the Greek word apostellein, which means to send forth, to send out on a mission.
They're in charge of spreading the message from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth.
But before they can conquer the world, they'll have to take on Palestine, one step at a time.
This was a small kind of movement at the beginning. There were no churches. There were no cathedrals. Nothing was being built. My guess is that Jesus would be surprised, if not appalled, by what he would see with the established church at the present day. Jesus founded nothing. He was a Jewish person with a Jewish message about God and God's empire. And certainly Jesus did not imagine anything that would involve building edifices and having large budgets and being politically involved with the status quo. Jesus really was against all of that and had a different kind of vision.
They weren't really interested in building churches or any kind of structure because the end of the world is coming.
Jesus' message appears to have been that the kingdom of God was coming imminently.
The fact that Jesus is resurrected from the dead, that's a signal that the end of time is beginning.
And those who follow him, those who believe in God, are going to be saved.
You know, there was no point building buildings if they're all going to be destroyed in 2-3 years. So their model was to go somewhere, to evangelize, and then to press on to somewhere else. They really thought that they were perched on a cliff at the end of time. And that spurred the apostles on to spread the message as quickly as they did and as widely as they did.
This kind of wandering lifestyle could really be described as a kind of insightful homelessness.
But they had to meet somewhere. So the question is, where do they meet?
The pagans have temples, the Jews have synagogues, the apostles have the dining room.
The apostles met probably in private homes.
And spread the message of Jesus that way.
Women who were responsible for running domestic life were often very important in these households.
We had wealthy women who were opening up their homes, offering the disciples room and board.
Women in general served as patrons to the apostles.
Some believe that Mary Magdalene was one of a number of wealthy women supporting the apostles and their followers.
We do know that there's a place in Luke that mentions that she offered her resources to the Jesus movement.
But where did her money come from? Is she indeed the prostitute that's been depicted for nearly 1,400 years?
There's nothing like that in the New Testament. Nothing about her being a prostitute. Nothing about her being the woman caught in adultery.
My best guess is that she's a wealthy widow who runs a major fishing business.
It's possible that Mary was named after Magdala, a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee.
We simply don't know. The Gospels just aren't interested in telling us about her.
They don't tell us, for instance, if Mary would have chosen to keep her support of the Jesus movement a secret. The Romans had executed Jesus. Why not go after his followers too?
It's commonly thought that once Christianity started, it was immediately declared an illegal religion and that the Christians had to go in hiding in the catacombs. This point of view comes mainly from watching too many late-night movies.
The Jesus followers are absolutely not being hunted down by the Romans in 34, 35.
The Romans in these early years don't distinguish what we call Christians from Jews. And you can understand why. They're worshiping the same God, they're reading the same texts, they're using the same language. They're Jews. And Romans have a history of leaving the Jews to deal with themselves.
Ironically, the network of Roman roads built to move their armies may be one of the reasons the apostles are able to spread the Christian movement so rapidly.
Actually, the Roman Empire provided excellent roads, wonderful cities. That all helped in the spreading of Christianity, so that the growth of Christianity owes a great deal to the Roman world and the Roman infrastructure.
If you were to ask a Roman soldier if he had heard of Jesus, even a couple of months after Jesus' execution, he probably hadn't.
But for the Jewish establishment, he isn't so easy to forget.
To the Jews, Jesus is something of a ridiculous fraud, even more so after he dies.
It would have been very difficult to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. When you talk about what the Messiah will be in first century Judaism, it's running out the Romans. It's the new Moses or the new David. Nobody expected the Messiah to be crucified. And that is a really hard thing to convince Jews of.
Especially a Jew like Paul of Tarsus. No one knows it at the time, but this man's impact on the birth of Christianity will be second only to Jesus himself.
We know quite a bit about Paul because he tells us about himself in his letters.
He was raised as a very zealous Jew who heard about the Christians and began to persecute them.
At this point in his life, Paul deeply opposes the Jewish Christians. One of them is a young man named Stephen.
Stephen is a Christian leader in Jerusalem who delivers a sermon that attacks the Jewish temple.
The way that Acts tells it, he basically condemns the Jews for having always rejected and killed the prophets. And now, look, they rejected and killed Jesus.
Paul doesn't deny that he wanted to destroy Jewish Christians like Stephen, but he stopped short of admitting complicity to murder. That part of the story can be found in Acts of the Apostles.
Acts puts Paul at the stoning of Stephen.
The Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court in Jerusalem, condemns Stephen to death for his subversive beliefs. It's the first Christian martyrdom, and it happens outside Jerusalem.
Now, what Acts wants us to think is that Paul is somehow truly involved in this. Now, we don't know to what extent this story is true.
If we're trying to look at realistic narrative, this isn't realistic narrative.
For one thing, it locates Paul in Jerusalem. Paul himself never says that he spent time in Jerusalem.
Luke presents the death of Stephen as a kind of mob action, and everybody just has a fit of rage and rushes out to stone him. Romans didn't let Jews execute each other for having differences of religious opinions. It would have been too much of a mess.
Whether truth or fiction, Paul's presence at the stoning of Stephen sets up one of the most dramatic plot twists in the history of Christianity.
Something happened to him, something that's called the Damascus Road incident, that changed his whole life.
In the book of Acts, he's on the road to Damascus, and he's going to persecute the Christians there with the authorization of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem.
And he's on his way there when he sees this blinding flash of light.
There was a bright light that was shining upon Paul, and a voice was heard, and the voice said, "Paul,
Why are you persecuting me?"
And Paul says, "Who's that?"
And the voice says, "I am Jesus, the one whom you are persecuting."
Paul is then instantly struck blind.
had to be led into Damascus by the hand.
Paul's sight is restored.
And Paul has a dramatic 180 turnaround.
From persecutor to apostle.
Paul's own letters say nothing about his miraculous encounter on the Damascus road.
Paul's account is much simpler. He simply says, when God revealed his son en emoi within me, in me, as a kind of inner experience, then I became a different person.
Paul claims his calling came directly from his own personal revelation of Jesus.
So the end story is the same. Paul goes from being a persecutor to being what turns out to be one of the best apostle for the movement.
And the way to do it was to hit the road and to start walking.
Paul has a plan to head north. He sets off on a series of journeys through Asia Minor and Greece.
Some people estimate that Paul traveled as far as 10,000 miles. In the ancient world, this wasn't easy.
Meanwhile, the apostles continue their work in Palestine.
The best reception that they get is when they're performing healings. They were casting out spirits and healing paralytics. We have these stories of people bringing out their sick relatives on mattresses and laying them down in the street. The distinctive thing about the Jesus followers is that they didn't accept payment. And this is what Christianity was offering people: free healthcare in a period when it was very expensive to see medical practitioners. And so for that reason alone, people flocked to Peter and Philip and John looking for healings. And then once you were there and you're a captive audience, then they tell you that the end of the world is nigh. And if you don't act now and join the Jesus movement, the end of the world could come and you could go to hell. This is a limited time offer. Buy now or you won't be saved. You can see what's suddenly appealing and engaging about that.
The apostles are making some headway spreading their message among the Jews because they already worship the same God. But it's a different story with the Gentiles.
Eventually, the followers of Jesus begin preaching not to Jews, but to Gentiles, to non-Jews. What characterized Gentiles in the Roman Empire is that all of them were polytheists. They worshipped many gods. Scholars today call them pagans.
The ancient religious climate was very diverse.
Pagans could worship any gods they wanted to. They could worship the great gods of Greek and Roman mythology. They could worship their local gods, gods of the city, gods in forests, gods in streams, gods of meadows, gods of war. There are gods of love. There are gods of childbearing.
It's a world that's thick with these superhuman personalities.
It's sort of like a buffet of ancient religions, and you can have as much of whatever you want.
So when the apostles insist that the pagans give up all their gods, they are met with great resistance.
It was all about power. The thing that pagan religions seemed to emphasize was that the gods provided things for people who worship them. We can't control if it rains, but the gods can. We can't control if the crops grow, but the gods can. We can't control if the livestock reproduces, but the gods can. The gods can do things for us, and when you turn your back on them,
A human will pay the price.
the gods are causing these problems because there are people among us who are not worshiping them. This is one of the reasons the early Christians were persecuted, because whenever a disaster would hit a town and there were Christians there, it was naturally assumed that it's those Christians.
Paul, on the other hand, is having great success spreading the Jesus message to the Gentile population of Greece and Asia Minor.
The way that Paul sets himself up somewhat audaciously is as apostle to the Gentiles.
Paul apparently thought that the message of salvation was not just for Jews. The message of God's salvation was supposed to go to the entire earth. And he believed that the reason he himself had been called by Christ was to take the message to the Gentiles.
Paul was actually a brilliant strategist.
His plan is not to bother with small towns, but to target the capitals.
Everyone comes in from the other cities to the capital regularly on business and all sorts of trade. And so if you get it to the capital, that'll get it out.
Paul ran a leather business.
And when people come in to buy what he's selling, he starts talking to them.
Importantly, he's able to speak their language.
Paul spoke Greek.
And because Paul could communicate, there was no limit on where his message could go.
He discusses religion with those who come to him.
You're at risk of being thrown into hell, where you're going to burn and have sulfur dripped on your body. You'll be lost forever.
Do you want to be on the side of Jesus, or do you want to be left behind? That was the compelling message of Paul.
He proves to be extremely good at convincing pagans that the Jewish God is more powerful.
More powerful than all the other pagan gods, as seen, for example, in the resurrection of Jesus, but also as seen in the miracles that his followers did.
Paul claims this one God is powerful enough to protect them from the wrath of all the others.
The universal deity of the whole world, who is responsible for its creation, for everyone in it, and for what will be its imminent destruction.
Many people are being convinced the Jesus movement is growing, and Peter and Paul, its two pillars, seem to have a shared vision and a shared approach.
Acts wants to kind of portray that Peter and Paul were almost sort of, two peas in a pod, you might say. But in actual fact, it seems that there really was some tension between Peter and Paul. Paul is extremely different from these guys. They're not literate. They're not well educated. They're not from a high social background. We're talking about fishermen here. While Paul is this guy who comes out of nowhere. He's a foreigner, he probably has an accent, and merely by being able to write, that marks Paul as clearly wealthy and privileged.
And the fact is, he seems to have known almost nothing about Jesus.
Paul never saw him. Paul wasn't there in Galilee.
He hasn't traveled with the living Jesus. He hasn't been at his crucifixion.
And he shows up one day and he says, I had a vision of Christ, and now I'm going to be an apostle too. I mean, can you imagine how frustrating that is if you're one of the original followers of Jesus?
But he wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to be an apostle. But Paul had all of these skeletons in his closet because people remembered, you were a bad dude once upon a time. And you were opposing us, and now you say you're one of our people, you're a Jesus person? Come on, Paul.
There are attempts to build some common ground, like when Paul invites Peter to a meal with his Gentile converts in the city of Antioch. Paul wants his new brothers to feel at home, and that means eating their way. Definitely not kosher. Paul explains it this way.
We all sat down together, one body, one group of believers, sharing together.
And then Peter is caught by his brothers from Jerusalem. His crime is eating non-kosher with non-Jews.
Paul thinks that if we're going to have a movement that includes Gentile converts, we have to be able to all dine together.
The men from Jerusalem do not agree, and Peter sides with them.
And Paul says, I stood up to his face and opposed him, saying, now you think you have to be kosher, and you think that we're second-class believers?
Paul thinks that's hypocritical.
According to Paul, he and Peter never reconcile. And Paul never doubts for a moment that he is the one who knows what's best for the movement.
Paul insists he got his gospel from nobody but from Jesus Christ himself.
That he did not learn anything about what he's doing from any human being. He got it all straight from Jesus.
Like deciding whether or not Gentiles who accept Jesus should be subject to ancient Jewish customs, like circumcision. At this point, early Christianity is still a Jewish movement, and circumcision is an immutable law all Jews must follow. But Paul is adamant that Gentiles be exempt.
Paul himself did not feel that circumcision was necessary to be a follower of Jesus.
He was quite forthright that anybody who's a Gentile who comes to believe in Jesus must not be circumcised.
That Jesus died for their salvation, and that's what they need to believe in.
If the law could save you, you wouldn't need Jesus.
And I think Paul ultimately is very practical. If you're trying to spread this religion and you put this in front, this is the requirement.
You're going to do what? To my what?
You're not going to win a whole bunch of grown male converts. It's just not going to happen.
And when a rival faction in Galatia defies him, he doesn't mince his words.
He basically starts his letter, "You stupid Galatians," and it goes downhill from there.
Paul said, "No, leave my people alone. They are good followers of Jesus without circumcision." You know, I wish those of you who are so happy with your knives and are so eager to circumcise would basically cut off your own stuff instead.
For the Gentiles, in place of circumcision, Paul needs to offer another initiation ritual.
Baptism was sort of an integral and very common part of ancient Judaism.
Paul adapts the ritual as a way for Gentiles to be reborn as followers of Jesus.
It's a fresh start. You get to start all over in this Jesus movement.
Baptism turns out to be a real success story. Impressive, considering Paul never even met Jesus. But in spite of this success, there will be plenty of bumps in the road ahead for the fledgling Jesus movement. In 41 AD, Rome installs a new king in Judea, Herod Agrippa, a Jew. Good news for the Jews, not so good for the Jesus followers, and a fatal turn of events for James.
The way the Acts tells it, Herod Agrippa comes to power, and in order to curry favor with the Jews, he executes the Apostle James by beheading. Immediately after killing James, Herod Agrippa realizes what a resounding success this was and arrests Peter, presumably with the same intent of executing Peter.
So he's in jail, and all of a sudden, an angel appears to him. Now, Peter thinks it's a dream, and the angel tells him to get up quickly, and the chains simply break free from his hands.
After his miraculous jailbreak in Jerusalem, Peter keeps a low profile. But 900 miles to the north, Paul does not. 50 AD, Paul has arrived in the Greek town of Philippi, continuing his mission to take his message to the Gentiles. A good day for Paul is a day when he can convert one more soul, even when it calls for an exorcism. He sets his sights on a slave girl, a fortune teller whose trances are a lucrative source of income for her handlers. Paul believes the girl is possessed by a demon and acts to save her. The girl's owners repay the favor by turning him in. Over the course of the next decade, Paul becomes very familiar with Roman dungeons.
Paul writes a lot. Paul talks a lot. Paul converts a lot. Paul's in jail a lot.
But Paul dreams of bringing his mission to Rome itself. One account that never makes it into the Bible has Paul arriving in Rome a free man.
Paul wanted to go to Rome so that he would have a kind of launching pad to bring the gospel to the end of the earth.
But the Bible tells a different story.
He was arrested in Jerusalem and then was taken to Rome to face trial. And the book of Acts ends then with Paul in jail in Rome.
Paul is behind bars. James is dead. And Peter has disappeared. But what about the rest of the 12? What does the Bible say about them?
We have almost no information whatsoever about these other apostles.
But we do have legends of their gruesome deaths.
Barnabas is flayed alive in Armenia.
Thomas is speared to death.
Andrew is executed on an X-shaped cross, presumably to make the suffering more acute.
We'll never know how true these legends really are. But something happens in 66 AD that is horribly real, leading many people to think the apocalypse has begun.
In the year 66, many Judeans had become fed up with Roman rule, and there was an uprising. The Romans laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, a siege that lasted several years.
The accounts that we have of that particular siege of Jerusalem are ghastly. People were dying inside. People didn't have any water, didn't have any food inside. Because the Romans had a very nice way of surrounding a walled city. They would simply set up camp outside, take their time, and wait out the people inside. Just wait until people would die out or would surrender. And that eventually happened between the years 66 and 70. Eventually, the Romans went in and destroyed the rest of the city and then destroyed the temple of God. The holy temple of God is destroyed. What a trauma for the Jewish community.
This was a cataclysmic event for ancient Jews.
And when you put that event next to this Christian message of the end is coming, God is bringing judgment, Christians began to see the destruction of the temple as divine punishment for killing Jesus. And that seems to be, understandably, a dividing point.
It is a dividing point between the Jewish era to which the apostles belonged and a new age that would eventually be called Christian.
Somewhere near the end of the first century is the first time that we have Christians using the term Christian with reference to themselves.
By the 4th century, the emperor Constantine converts, and 1,000 years later, Rome becomes the center of the Christian world. Legends say that both Peter and Paul died in Rome.
We do have a source from the first century that indicates that Peter and Paul were put to death during the persecution of Nero in the year 64.
There was this great fire in Rome that consumed most of the city.
You may have heard the story of Nero fiddling while Rome burns. It was a very bad PR thing for Nero, and he needed somebody to blame.
It was easy to blame the Christians because no one really liked them anyway.
It's possible that Paul is one of the Christians rounded up for execution.
Paul is beheaded. But an interesting thing happens when he's beheaded. Milk spurts out of his neck instead of blood. His death is ironically not death but life. And milk is that which gives life. And so by killing Paul, the Romans are inadvertently giving him birth.
Peter's death is also unique.
Peter's crucified, but upside down. People think Peter's crucified upside down because he says he's not worthy of dying in the same manner as Jesus. But that's not what Peter says in the Acts of Peter. He's illustrating the upside downness of the world, that the world that we live in is sinful, and the cross is what will right it.
We cannot be sure of the dates, but 70 years after the birth of Jesus, most of the apostles are probably dead, and the movement is in the hands of others.
It's not that the early apostles were converting thousands of people at one time. They were converting a few people here and there, but these few people converted other people who converted other people, and it started growing. It's one of the most amazing things that's ever happened in the history of religion.
When you think about everything that these believers had to overcome, persecutions, martyrdoms, imprisonments, crucifixions, and yet They set into motion a major world religion. It's astounding